Good evening, everybody. We're in the last night of our 4-week course, the Project Management Professional and Certified Associate in Project Management certification classes, preparation for those particular exams that you might be intending to sit with PMI. We have 4 sessions tonight. The first one is communications. We then cover risk management and finally procurement. We have ethics and professional conduct. Essentially, it's associated with PMI's Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. We have covered week 1 to all these various aspects, and we're into the final week, and these are the 4 topics that I've mentioned. 3 of them certainly we'll cover. The last one, we might have just a few quick words without going into it in any great detail. Okay. Communications, risk, procurement, samples, thresholds go out, and we do a look at the final exam details. Any of you who wish to sit the final exam, I'll be giving you some pointers as to what's required and what's involved. And we finally have a discussion from Neil McCosh, just talking about the IT master's degrees. Okay, communications management. Communication management is another one of the very important knowledge areas in PMBOK. Why is it important? I've heard it said that probably the success or failure of a project can be down to 80% of the project manager's ability to communicate. That might be a little bit overstretched. I think when that has been was suggested, it might have been the time that communications and stakeholder management was part and parcel of one knowledge area. So the two of them go hand in hand, stakeholder management and communications, and it is extremely important that we ensure that we have excellent communications and that we engage our stakeholders effectively. The whole idea behind communications is to create a bridge and links people and information for successful communication. There are only 3 processes in this particular knowledge area: planned communication management, managed communication, and control communications. There used to be, in the 4th edition, we had identified stakeholders and managed stakeholders' expectations, which were part and parcel of that particular knowledge area, but they're no longer there, and they're part of their own knowledge area. The 3 processes, we'll just look through it quickly and then go into them in a little bit more detail. Planned communication management is about determining information and communication needs of the stakeholders and plan to satisfy those. So it's the who, the what, the when, the how. We manage communications by creating, collecting, distributing, storing and retrieving information for stakeholders. It's all part and parcel of implementing the communication plans. And of course, like all other knowledge areas, with one exception, which is human resources, we need to control the various aspects of that knowledge area. And here we've got controlled communications, and that's about ensuring communication requirements are met and we take corrective actions as needed. This is a simplistic view where the who, the why, the what, the how, etc. This is part and parcel of the stakeholder management. So I noticed that I can't be heard, but there's no message coming up at the moment to suggest that I've lost connection. So if anybody else can't hear me, please highlight the fact that I'm not being heard. I can hear. That's good. Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so we identify the stakeholders, assess the stakeholders' relative impact, determine the information to be shared, select the mediums used, choose the frequency of the message, choose double check that everything is recorded and accessible. So all these things are a very simplistic view of what we can undertake in terms of communication management and the involvement of stakeholders. Sorry, back to the previous. We need to, when we're examining stakeholders, we came up with the power interest grid as one of the ways of looking and assessing where the stakeholders' power and interest lay within the overall project. So we need to consider that in terms of how we're going to communicate. So we ascertain the communication needs of the stakeholders, determine the information content and frequency and urgency. So how frequently do we need to communicate? What medium do we use? Do we use internet? Do we use emails? Do we use meetings? All these things is a whole range of different types of forms of communication that we may consider. We assign resources and responsibilities, and that is associated with communication. Who's going to be responsible for taking on the different types of communications? We have types of communication which may be considered in different ways. There's internal and external. So that's internal within our organization. External is outside the organization. There's formal and informal communication. Formal is maybe the minutes of a meeting. Informal might be an email. Vertical is going up the chain, and horizontal is going across. Official and unofficial, we've written and oral, and we've verbal and non-verbal. The main inputs into communication management when we're doing up our plan is the stakeholders registers, where we identify the stakeholders, and there are environmental factors. One of the questions I have later on actually asked for the inputs, and they're not listed there, so apologies for that. Main output from this particular exercise is our communications plan. And of course that communication plan forms part of your overall project management plan. Tools and techniques, communications requirements analysis. This is a very interesting little formula there. Determine the number of communication channels. And N is the number of team members involved. So if you take the N, the number of team members involved, so if there are 10 people involved in your that need to be communicated and cross-communicate with each other, you'd have 10 multiplied by 10 minus 1, which is 9 divided by 2, which was 90 divided by 2 is 45. So the channels of communication would be 45. What technology do we use? Well, it depends on the urgency, the availability, etc., etc. The different types of models. There's sender and receiver. There's encoding and decoding. Feedback and noise, all these things affect your ability to communicate. Effective communication is the responsibility of the sender. That's an important consideration. So the person who's actually giving out the message, like me here at the moment, I'm giving the message. Unfortunately, I'm not in a real position to understand if the message is being received effectively. However, we do have our little questions box where you actually are indicating various feedback in terms of the communication. I've got a question here. Could you please explain the comms requirement analysis further? Well, really, at the end of the day, what is everybody's requirements? You may have people who need to have, they say, look, it's sufficient for me to have emails. I don't need anything more formal than that. You may have senior management in the organization who want to see the formal business minutes from minutes. You may have progress reports that need to be laid out in a certain way. So really, it depends on the individual who will determine what type of requirements or how the communication is meant to be or how it's effectively conveyed. We have the concept of interactive communication, push and pull. So push might be where we put it onto the internet. Pull means where somebody actually will actually pull the information down from the internet. Sorry, push is more an email and pull is pulling it down from the internet. We have meetings. This little diagram here, just talk about it very quickly. We have the sender sending the message and the message gets decoded by the receiver. The receiver then understands or thinks they understand what you've just said. They will feedback and the sender gets decoded, and then they will determine whether you have actually received the message effectively or not. And the little down lines are recognize there may be noise, and that noise doesn't actually mean physical noise. It could mean that there are ways and means of affecting the ability for you to get the communication across to the receiver. The managed communication is the next step, which is all about following the plan. In other words, we're up and running, the project is in the execution stage, and we are following the plan. We're creating, we're collecting, distributing, storing, retrieving, and eventually we'll dispose of information. All this is on behalf of the stakeholders. Main inputs is the plan, telling us how we should go about this. You've got work performance reports, and the tools and techniques would include things like communication technology, models, methods, etc. And the output is project communications. In other words, we have effectively communicated. We may have presentations that we need to undertake to, particularly in terms of status reports and any updates the stakeholders would require. The third and final process in communications is to ensure communications is meeting the stakeholder requirements. So maybe it might just be a verbal, are you getting the sufficient communication? Are we conveying the message? You may do surveys to get an understanding if people are actually receiving the message appropriately. One of the worst things is if you haven't identified stakeholders, or people who should be identified are not getting communications and they feel left out, they may actually have a negative effect on your project because of the fact that they're don't understand what's going on. There isn't appropriate communication, and therefore there is frustration and lack of understanding of what's actually happening. So we need to develop the contents for performance reports from performance data and compare it to the baseline. So how are we doing? How does it compare with what we said we would undertake in terms of our communication plans? These are the inputs, and the tools is one of them is an information management system, which is quite important, and the outputs then work performance information, change requests, and lessons learned. So very quickly we'll ask you this question, and if you don't mind just putting into your little box there, the discussion or question box, the answer you think is appropriate. So the inputs to the planned communication management process include which of these? As I said, they haven't been given completely in the earlier slides, so I'm assuming some of you will have done your study, and most of you are suggesting A, where is in fact the right answer is C. The answer that it suggests that you need the organizational structure to know exactly what you, in terms of communication plan, who do you need to organize or who do you need to communicate, and all the other ones are appropriate. So hard copy document management, electronic communication management, and web interfaces to scheduling and project management software are examples of. So what would we say the answer to this one is? It looks as if we're getting C's, and yes, we're getting alternatives, but C's is the right answer. So we have information management systems is the correct answer. Moving along to the next one. We happened to mention this a little bit earlier on. The total number of potential communication channels for a project with N equals 12 stakeholders is, well, actually leave the 12 out there. It just means what is the formula that we would use. Actually, no, it does actually ask you to work it out. So you can actually put in 12 into an appropriate formula and come up with the answer. So, well, actually, no, it's not, because the answer is correct answer is A, as most people have said. So I apologize for that. I'm not sure where that 12 has come in. Moving on to the next process, which is risk management. Risk management is all about increasing the probability and impact of positive events and opportunities. It decreases the probability and impact of negative events. So the important thing is that risk is not always about threats and negative. There are aspects associated with risk management which are all about determining possible opportunities that may arise and making sure that we capitalize on those opportunities. There are quite a few processes involved, and we can see under planning we've got these 5 processes, and under monitoring and control we have the usual controlling of the particular aspects of that particular knowledge area. And there is a misconception by a lot of people to suggest that risks are always negative. Risk management, so let's look at these in detail. Well, not in detail, sorry. We'll look at a higher level summary of what each one of these actually, what it involves. So plan risk management is define how to conduct risk management activities for a project. Like all plans, we have 2 approaches. So firstly is we determine what is our baseline. Our baseline, for example, in terms of cost, is our cost baseline. In terms of time, it's our schedule. In terms of things like risk management, what is our baseline? Essentially is we've identified the risks and we have determined exactly how we're going to manage those risks. Actually, that's the second part. So when we've done the first part, which is identify the baseline, then we determine how we're going to manage those for the rest of the project. The next step in the next process under risk management is identifying risks. Determine which risks may affect the project and document the characteristics. We do 2 different analyses. The first one is perform a qualitative risk analysis, which involves prioritizing the risk for further analysis or action through probability of occurrence and impact. The perform quantitative analysis is where we start using numerical analysis of the risks and trying to determine the overall effect on the project in terms of the outcome of that numerical analysis. How are we going to respond to these risks? And that's essentially in terms of identifying the risks, so therefore what are the options, the actions to enhance the opportunities and to reduce the threats? And we'll be looking at those in a little bit more detail. We're up and running and we need to control the risks. So control risks is all about implementing risk response plan, track risks, monitor residual risks, identify new risks, evaluate risk process throughout the project. So that's a very important consideration. Risk management is an ongoing activity. Not only are we trying to reduce the risks that we've already identified or try to ensure that they don't morph into a problem. So we're back. Hopefully I have managed to get down as far as control risks and that you have been with me as far as that's concerned. And that's really, as we're up and running with the project, we implement risk response plan, track risks, monitor residual risks, identify new risks and evaluate risk process. That should be progress throughout the project. So one of the things that people tend to misrepresent or mix up, a risk is not an actual problem or an issue. It's only a problem or an issue if the risk that we have identified actually materializes and turns into a problem or an issue. So that is a very important concept. The difference between a risk is not something that is a problem until something occurs and it becomes a problem. The next thing is plan risk management in a little bit more detail. So how to conduct risk management activities, how to manage the risks as we go through the project. The plan is how to identify, rank, response and control risks, which is the first step. And then we focus on the process and mechanics of managing those risks as we go through the project. We need to determine what our stakeholders' attitudes are to risks. You know, some stakeholders will be very adventurous and will be we'll be happy to take on risks. Others are risk averse and they would be very reluctant to take on risks. So that is very much a part and parcel of how you manage your risks. The inputs are there. I'm not going to go through them, and the tools and techniques include the analytical techniques and expert judgment. Output is the risk management plan, and what should be in the plan are all of these and maybe more as we have identified here. So the control risk sounds, Alphonse, you're suggesting that it should be part of execution process. Actually, no, anytime that you're controlling something, it's part of monitoring and controlling. So deciding on categories and probability measurements. Well, you try to categorize your risks in such a way that it helps you to manage them, and it also helps you to identify them. So you start identifying now what are the possible technical risks, what are the organization, what are the external, what are the project management risks, etc. Also in terms of the risk probability and impact. So you might have a probability definition which might include low, medium, high, or you might use a scale of 0 to 1. Really, it's up to you to decide in terms of your project what's the most appropriate way to determine your probability. Your impacts may be defined descriptively, or such as a 10 to 20% cost increase. Okay, so just a problem is merely a problem. Not having a plan to deal with that problem is a failure. So really that's emphasizing the point of having a risk management plan. Identifying risks. When we identify risks, the first place we will put that risk or record that risk is in a risk register. And the risk register is something that you build up as you're going through your project. So once you've identified your risk, you will put it in there, and then you will start building up all the other elements of the risk as you're going through the cycle of risk management. And this is just an example of a potential risk register. So it includes lists of risks, etc., all these things that you see here. So moving on to finding risks, you look at various documents to see what information you got, everything from contracts to statements of work, etc. You do information gathering techniques like brainstorming, asking anybody suggest what may be the risk in this particular situation. The Delphi approach, which is asking the experts and eventually getting that feedback shared and then getting a consensus. We do interviews, root cause analysis, all these things like checklists, assumption analysis. We've got these strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and we've got various diagramming techniques. And this is just a quick look at a cause and effect diagram, which tends to pop up in various places throughout PMBOK. Essentially, you determine what the problem is at the end here on the right hand, then you work backwards and figure out what are all the various possible causes and the risks that may be associated with the particular outcome that you're looking at. We've got risk analysis as the next process. You do different types of risk analysis. The first one is a qualitative, and you're asking yourself, does this risk really matter? So you're looking at the probability, impact and priority, and then you're looking at the quantitative aspect. Oh, how much is it going to hurt? What are the consequences? What are the restoration costs? The other thing is it urgent or important? Again, that helps you to determine the priority. And whose risk is it? Is it somebody who's going to take ownership, and you do need to take ownership of all risks? So performing qualitative risk analysis, which is the first analysis that you might undertake. So the whole idea is to rank your risks. You include them in the risk register. These are all the tools and techniques that you would use to perform qualitative risk analysis. And as I said, it's all about ranking your risks, determining what the impact and the probability is. And the output is an updated project document, which includes your risk register and assumptions log. Moving on to the second analysis, which is perform quantitative risk analysis, and that provides a numerical estimate, numerical estimates to understand risk related to people, business, the environment, markets, or other areas of interest. Sometimes and often the level of analysis requires people with fairly good expertise in statistical probability and distribution techniques. However, you'll see that there are one or two techniques that we can use that doesn't require that level of expertise. Your starting point is your risk register, and the tools and techniques include data gathering and representative techniques, quantitative risk analysis and modeling techniques, and expert judgment, and the output is project document updates, which include your risk register and your assumptions log. So this is an example of a decision tree to come up with an expected monetary value for a particular aspect of your project, or it can be a project, but this is just a decision you want to make in terms of going on a cruise. And you've got a choice of flying to your destination, and if you take airline A, it costs $900 and it's on time 90% of the time. The alternative is to take airline B, which only costs $300 but is only on time 70% of the time. Now you want to ensure you don't miss this cruise, because if you don't, if you miss the cruise, that actually you're going to lose the $4,000 that you spent, and that's essentially the cost, irrespective of which airline. If you don't arrive on time, that is the cost. The earned value then starts. You look at airline A, which will say, because it gets in at 90% of the time, you're actually going to look at the late fee of $4,000, but 90% of the time of the 90% of the time, which leaves you with 10% 10% impact. So you multiply that 10% by the 4,000, and that gives you 400 plus the 900 that is a definite, which will give you $1,300. And the B for your expected monetary value, because 70% is on time, so therefore it's 30% late, so that is your impact, and your impact by the $4,000 gives you eventually it gives you $1,200, and add that to the 300 gives you $1,500. So all of a sudden it becomes quite obvious to somebody who's done this calculation that really you should be taking airline A, even though it costs you $900 compared to the airline B, which is $300. You may be somebody who is adventurous and is quite happy to take on risks, and you might say, well, it's well worth taking the chance and spending the $300. So you see the attitude that various people might have in terms of their approach towards risks. So in terms of risk response, you've got the positive risks or opportunities. The alternatives are to share, to enhance, to exploit, or to accept. Share means you're involving a third party. You see an opportunity and you capitalize on that opportunity by getting other people involved. You enhance by improving the probability or magnifying the impact. You exploit, you identify steps to capture the opportunity. And finally, you accept, you don't do any changes. You just, if it comes about, it comes about, and that's great. You'll accept the positive outcome. So if you look at the negative side of things, you've got the threats you avoid by changing your plan to eliminate the risk. You might transfer, which means you're shifting it to a third party. That's often taking out insurance, so that if it does happen, you get compensated by the insurance company. You've got mitigate, so you induce the risk by taking an alternative like employing more people to ensure that you get the work done and that it doesn't actually go over the time that you think it might. And then finally you accept, which means that you don't take any action unless the issue arises. So again, it's something that you're not going to concern yourself about. If the threat comes about, okay, you'll live with it and you'll take whatever action needs to be taken at that time. Controlling risk is the final process. And that is, as you're going through your project, you implement the risk response plan, you track and reassess identified risks and monitor any residual risks. Identify new risks, very important. As I said, it's an ongoing activity. You need to keep looking at potential risks that may come out of nowhere. So how is the risk process going throughout the project, and take corrective action if you're not if things are not working out the way you expect. And these are all the tools and techniques that you would use for monitoring and controlling risks. These are just some of the common risk errors, and this is really just an additional set of observations that if you don't do these things, you may end up with a greater level of errors arising from risks eventuating. So incomplete risk identification. Actually, I'm not going to read through them all. I'll leave them there for you to review when you look at the slides at a later stage. So just last point there is quite good. Contracts are usually signed long before risks to the projects are discussed. So all of a sudden you may have a fixed price contract and it hasn't taken account of all the risks that may have an effect on the overall cost of the project itself. Okay, quickly run through these questions here. To be successful, an organization should be committed to addressing risk management. So is it a just in time before a meeting, proactively and consistently throughout the project, as soon as time and cost estimates are ready, or as early as possible in execution phase? Wow, look at that. Most people are saying B, and you're dead right. Well done. Moving on to the next question. The primary output of the identify risk process is the A, B, C, or D. We're getting A's. Well done. Good work. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Next question is a thorough analysis of what will help identify potential risks to the project. So is it A, B, C, or D? There is quite a variety of answers there. So really, the thorough analysis of the risk identification checklist would be the appropriate answer. So yes, the A is the correct answer. Now moving into the next knowledge area, which is procurement management. And procurement management is all about performing the processes to purchase, acquire products, services, or results from outside the project team. So procurement management, sometimes people assume that procurement management is all about procuring these material services or whatever from outside the organization. No, it's outside the team. So you can actually procure from internally within your organization, but it's outside the project itself. Includes the contract management and change control processes required to administer contracts or purchase orders. And it's all about it's all framed around the perspective of the buyer-seller relationship. These are the processes that are involved. There are 4 processes: the planning, conduct, control, and closing. Notice the fact that this is only one of 2 processes in the closing process group. The other one is to close close phase or project. So it's all about getting the right materials in the right place at the right time, ready for intended use. Very good synopsis of what we're trying to achieve. So the procurement management plan is how will procurements be conducted. The conduct procurements is prepare the documentation, evaluate and select the responses. Control procurements is all about ensuring terms of contracts are met, managing relationship performance and change. And finally, we've got close procurements, which is formally close out each contract after completion or termination. There's quite a level of importance associated with the different terms that we use in procurement management, and a lot of you will be familiar with many of these terms, but there are some other terms that may be new to you, and it's important that you do know what we're talking about when we're talking about these terms. PMBOK tends to focus on the term buyer, but the word buyer can be any of these. All different terms can be used as the buyer. And the seller is also another word that PMBOK tends to use. And the seller can be any of these here that we've got listed. So in terms of the contracts, PMBOK prefers to use agreement rather than contracts, because agreements can be something that is not necessarily a formal contract. Essentially, it can be something that is drawn up to actually have an understanding and may not have the same legal binding as a full-fledged contract. Planned procurement management is your first process. It determines what resources are required and you create the plan. So the inputs include requirements documentation, activity resource requirements. This comes from your time management, where when you're drawing up your activities, you determine what resources you require. And therefore, that helps to determine where we need to source those resources from. So organization process assets may determine what type of contracts you need to use in your particular project. In other words, that is the organizational approach, and that's what we normally do around here. Tools and techniques. And the outputs will include your project management plan. It may include things like a statement of work. Procurement almost certainly include procurement documents and selection criteria. What are the criteria we're going to use to select our particular vendor when we need to make a selection? So procurement documents have a whole range of different terms. See, these are some of the more well known ones are used. RFP is often referred to, which is a request for proposal. So it details a plan for project execution and price. So you actually ask people to submit a proposal. IFB, invitation for bid, or RFB is request for bid. So it's used to develop, if you develop the scope, know the work and want vendor to do the work, it's a bid is usually where you're actually submitting a price. So you're asking people to come up with a price for the particular work that you're actually undertaking. RFQ, request for quotation. So that often is in terms of the type of products that you may get in from a retail or type service. For example, you want to buy computers, so you will ask various organizations for quotations. These are different types of contracts that you might enter into. There are fixed price contracts, or lump sum. They tend to be similar. Essentially, a fixed price is one price for all work. So you will tell your customer that this is the price you're going to do the work for. It's an all-in price. However, you will suggest that if the scope changes, the price will adjust, so that'll be part of your contract. So the buyer has the least risk if scope is defined. So the person who is buying this has a fixed price and they know exactly what they're up for. Unfortunately, the contractor has to try and work within that price and make sure that we don't, if you're the contractor, don't go over the price. There is other forms of this fixed price incentive fee. If you deliver the end result before the time, you might get an incentive, which is normally time-based. You've got the cost reimbursable or cost plus. That means that often there's an agreement that the a contractor will charge for all the costs that have been incurred and then put a margin on top, which is their margin that is essentially their profit, an agreed profit. So the customer is going to cover all the contractor's costs and then will agree to a particular percentage on top of that. And these are the acronyms are often used in these things, and you can see the acronyms used in the diagram below. A time and material is a contract whereby you will agree the price, you will agree the rate that you're going to charge people for the time they're going to put into it. You're not sure how long it's going to take, and because of that lack of clarity, you're actually saying that no matter what work we undertake, we're going to be charging for that work. So that really is where the buyer has the greatest risk, because they don't know what they're going to end up paying. And often that's a situation in terms of software development where it's very difficult to come up with an accurate schedule, and therefore it's very difficult to come up with a price. So it's important that you know the different types of contracts. A statement of work, I'm just using this, putting this up here because it crops up every so often. Essentially, a statement of work is an agreement between the supplier or the vendor and the customer. The customer might say, this is the work that we expect you to undertake, and these are all the details associated with the work. And that's often incorporated or linked in with the contract. So the contract and the statement of work, contract may refer to the statement of work saying, you will undertake the work as laid out in the statement of work. The next process is conduct procurement. So we've obtained the responses from the various vendors or various potential vendors, and we have selected which one, and then we award the contract. So the input includes the procurement management plan, procurement documents. What is our selection criteria? How do we select before we award the contract? And then we may draw up a statement, or sorry, the statement of work has already been drawn up and shared with the various contractors and vendors. So we're conducting the procurement, which means that we need to select and award the contract. The tools and techniques, we have a concept called bidder conference. Bidder conference is where we get all the various people who want to bid for a particular bit of work to come together, and everybody shares the answers to various questions that are asked at that conference. We have proposal evaluation techniques, independent estimate. You might get some estimate before you actually look at the prices that have been produced by your vendors, just to make sure that it's a type of sanity check. And then you may have some negotiation after you select the vendor, just to ensure that everybody understands exactly what's involved, and only after you've done the procurement negotiation will you actually award the contract. So it's all about selecting the sellers, drawing up an agreement. We need to understand when the services, when the products, when the materials, whatever is going to be delivered, when they're going to be delivered. So that will affect our calendar and may affect our schedule. So I'm just noticing there in the corner of my eye, what is the difference of a bid and a QAT? I'm not sure what a QAT is, but essentially a bid is it's usually somebody putting in a price, and there's competition to see who's going to actually come up with the best price. And then there's the proposal, which is responding to a request for proposals saying this is what we propose to do, which may be coming up with a totally new way of doing things and saying this is going to cost you more, but we can do it in a different way. Quotation, sorry. A bid is where you're actually bidding for work, which is usually it's a good question actually. A quotation is usually for something that already exists. As I said, like computers, you want to purchase computers. A bid is usually to undertake work. So there's a statement of work that says this is what we want you to bid for, and you will say, well, it's going to cost us X amount to do this work. Moving on to the next process, which is controlled procurement. So it's all about managing relationships, monitoring performance, and making changes as we go through. And the inputs include procurement management plan, procurement documents, agreement, work performance reports. The tools and techniques we include is contract change control system. So how do we control our contracts? We have procurement performance reviews. How are we getting, how's our vendor or contractor performing? We do inspections and audits, which may also be part and parcel of quality control. And we've a payment system. How do we pay our vendors? And we may end up with claims which usually arise when there's a dispute, or we need to sort out things which may be a little bit more than just from a mutually understandable and agreeable result. And the output will include work performance information. So the final process, in all we've gone through so far, is closed procurements. And that is a formal completion of each contract. So we need to sign off and conclude every contract. And these are the inputs, the tools and techniques. And finally, the output is a completed agreement with your vendor, or you may terminate the agreement either by mutual agreement, or maybe that the termination may have other repercussions further down the track. And it's important that you've written notice that you've actually closed the contract. So that brings us into the questions. The first question is, generally a bid differs from a proposal in that the term, which one is it, A, B, C, or D? The first answer I had was B, but unfortunately most of the other answers are no. There's quite a mixture. You remember I did mention that bid was all to do with submitting a price that you're willing to agree to undertake the work. So A is the correct answer here. The second question here, the buyer usually through its authorized procurement administrator provides the seller with what as an output of the closed procurement process? A, B, C, or D? So we're getting A's. Yes, A's, the majority of A's, and yes, the A's have it. And then finally, which of the following is one of the terms used to describe contested changes and potential constructive changes where the buyer and seller cannot reach an agreement on compensation for the change or cannot agree that a change has occurred? A, B, C, or D? So we're getting a mixture of answers here. B, C. It was one of the last points that we made in the last process, and that is claims. We actually may have to, sorry, it's the previous process, we may have to raise a claim to suggest that there is a difference of opinion, and this is a formal recognition of that difference of opinion. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the ethics and professional conduct, not that it is not important. As a profession, PMI expect anybody who's involved with PMI to follow the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. Why are we doing it here? Well, essentially, it used to be, as part of the exam, there used to be separate questions that would pop up in the exam that were specifically related to the Code of Ethics. Now what happens is the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct is intertwined within various questions, and it will ask to you as a project manager, how would you react to this particular situation where there is an ethical consideration, or you're actually asked to act in a professional way. And it's just testing to see how you would actually respond in that way. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. So the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct is all about aspiring to meet these standards in all aspects of our lives, at work, home, etc. It describes the expectations we have of ourselves and our fellow practitioners, and it will help us, assist us in making wise decisions, etc. There are two types of standards associated with the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. There's mandatory and aspirational. The mandatory says you have to, as a project manager, or anybody involved with PMI, needs to comply with those. The aspirations describe the conduct that we strive to uphold as practitioners. And to whom does it apply? All PMI members, individuals who are not PMI members but meet one of the following criteria. What is the structure of the code? It's divided into sections that contain standards of conduct and align with the 4 anchoring values. Some sections of this code include comments, so you have little comments that help to explain. They're not mandatory parts of the code but provide examples and other clarification. And a glossary can be found at the end of the standard, and the glossary defines words and phrases used in the code. I have a little link here that I could click, and up would come the Code of Ethics. However, I'm not going to do that now. And if you click on that with your PDF form of this presentation, it's not going to work either. But I suggest you can go into the PMI website and you will see the Code of Ethics is readily available. Very important, what are the anchors of the ethics code? Earlier on today I was talking about the core values of an organization and listing out the core values of an organization. So these are very similar to the core values. Here we've got responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. And a nice little chart or diagram here that actually represents those. If you look across the top of the page, or sorry, the turquoise box, Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct is made up of responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty, which are the values. And the definition of those values talks about the responsibility is ownership of decisions and actions, respect is treatment of people and resources, and fairness is to do with objective and impartial decisions, and finally honesty is understanding the truth and truth-based action. And under each of these you've got the various ways and means that you comply with that definition of values. So it's the conduct that is expected of you, honouring commitments, upholding legal and ethical rules. We also have under respect, good faith, non-abusive respect for resources. Under fairness we have transparency, proper handling of conflicts of interest, proper motive in decisions. And then finally honesty, no deception and no dishonest behaviour. Okay, that essentially covers all the topics that we have undertaken to cover in the last 4 weeks. So let's concentrate for those who are doing the final exam. The exam is open from the 12th of August and is available to you until the 19th of August. And of course, make sure that wherever you are situated, that you align yourself with Australian Eastern Standard Time. Exam pass mark is 50%. The time limit is 1 hour. So you have one attempt only. And when we say one attempt, within that hour, you can continue to review and answer your questions. So you can attempt this exam only once during the 1 week period. In fact, you can actually leave the exam and come back in, but that has to be within the hour. The prerequisites, the cost, there's no cost involved. It's free. Okay, thank you. Some people are answering the questions for me. That's good. Prerequisites, you must have achieved a pass mark for each weekly quiz to be eligible to sit the exam. So if you haven't done your weekly quizzes, you can still do them. Each quiz may be attempted as many times as necessary, and the weekly quiz marks are participation marks and do not influence the final mark of the exam. The quiz contains 40 multiple choice questions. These questions are from the content presented in the live online webinar discussion, and each topic has 10 questions presented, 5 per page. So very similar to the questions that we have been asking all along, both during the presentation but also the weekly quizzes. They're all essentially on a similar vein. So the 1 hour, and after that hour your quiz will expire and we will not be able to answer any further questions. If you log off and reconnect, you can still continue, but after the hour, that's the end of it. Not available until you achieve a required score in week 4 quiz. So that means that you have to build up to being able to undertake week 4 quiz, and then you can actually do the final exam. So available from the 12th of August. And that essentially concludes everything. So let's go back. So all the reading materials that are similar to what has come up every other week. And these are I apologize for that, the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide. The chapters you need to read are 9, 10, 11, and I think 12. So these are this is last week's page, so I need to update that, and I'll do that before they're actually posted. And I know what's happened. Actually, all the answers to the questions are here, so we have the right slide, so that's okay. Okay, so what I need to do now is to find out if Neil, you're available and online at the moment. But before I do that, I'd just like to say that it has been a very rushed presentation over the last 4 weeks. I'm very aware of the fact that I have been speaking very quickly, but hopefully I have covered, there's been a positive in that I've covered a wide amount of material in that time, and hopefully that has been to your satisfaction. So in other words, rather than take things in a very slow fashion and not cover anywhere near as much as I have done, I think the approach I've taken is to your liking. At least I hope it is. So Neil, are you available to take over from here?
I am, Peter. Thank you very much.